I saw them switch drink. 4 words whispered by a terrified waitress. 4 words that would stop the most dangerous man in New York in his tracks and expose a betrayal meant to end his life. But here's what makes this story so powerful, what makes it so dangerous. That waitress wasn't supposed to matter. She was invisible. Just service. Pouring champagne at a private table where trust was currency and betrayal was death. And that man in the expensive suit, the one who switched the glass? He never even glanced at her. He thought no one was watching. He was wrong. This is the true story of how the smallest voice in the room saved the biggest storm in the city. How one woman's courage exposed a deadly conspiracy. And how one whispered truth changed everything. Not just for a mafia boss who trusted no one, but for a waitress who'd spent her whole life trying to disappear. Stay with me, because what happens next will remind you why speaking up, even when you're invisible, even when you're terrified, even when the most dangerous man in New York is seconds away from death, is the bravest thing anyone can do. This is Betty's story. And it starts in the most unlikely place. While you're here, please hit the subscribe button and comment your view on the story and where you're watching from. Let me tell you a story that will restore your faith in the power of courage. It's about a waitress named Betty Easton, just trying to survive in New York City, who changed the life of one of the most feared men in the world. And she did it with just one sentence. This happened in Manhattan, in one of those exclusive restaurants where reservations cost more than most people's rent. The kind of place that catered to power. The restaurant belonged to the elite, a world where shadows held threats and every handshake carried weight. Inside, everything was opulent. Marble floors so polished they reflected danger, crystal chandeliers that hung like frozen lightning, and men in tailored suits who spoke in whispers that decided fates. But Betty didn't belong there. Not really. She was just a waitress, a woman named Betty Easton who worked double shifts just to keep her tiny apartment and survive another month in the city. Life wasn't easy, but she never complained. Her mother had taught her something simple but powerful. Keep your head down, work hard, and stay invisible. In a world run by dangerous men, invisibility was survival. That particular night, the restaurant's most exclusive private room had been reserved. Betty's supervisor told her the client was Jose Newton. The name alone made the kitchen staff go quiet. He was the storm everyone whispered about. The mafia boss who controlled half the city. The man who wasn't just feared, he was a legend wrapped in danger. Betty was assigned to his table. She felt her heart race, not from fear exactly, but from something she didn't want to name. She'd seen him before from a distance. Dark eyes that missed nothing. A presence that made the air feel heavier. She stood in the hallway outside the private room, smoothing her apron, reminding herself to be invisible. Just pour the drinks. Clear the plates. Don't make eye contact. Don't speak unless spoken to. That's how you survive in his world. But being invisible is hard when danger and destiny are about to meet in the same room. Jose Newton sat at the head of the table like a king surveying his kingdom, except his kingdom was built on fear, and his throne was carved from the bones of men who'd crossed him. The private dining room was dimly lit, all dark wood and shadows that seemed to breathe with secrets. Crystal glasses caught the candlelight and threw it back like tiny warnings. This was his world. Controlled. Calculated. Deadly. He wore a black suit that probably cost more than Betty's annual salary, but it wasn't the clothes that made him terrifying. It was the stillness. The way his dark eyes tracked every movement in the room without his head ever turning. The way his bodyguards stood like statues against the walls, hands folded, eyes scanning, always scanning. The way the 4 men seated around him, his associates, his business partners, whatever they called themselves, spoke in careful, measured tones, as if one wrong word might be their last. Every shadow held a threat he couldn't ignore. That's what it meant to be Jose Newton. To live in a world where trust was a luxury he couldn't afford and betrayal wore expensive cologne. Betty pushed through the service door with a tray of appetizers, her hands steady even though her pulse wasn't. She'd trained herself for this. Be efficient. Be invisible. Serve and retreat like a ghost. That's what women like her did in rooms like this. They survived by not being seen. But the moment she stepped into that room, she felt his gaze on her skin.
Warm.
Dangerous. Captivating. She set the plates down with practiced precision, careful not to let her fingers tremble. His associates barely glanced at her. To them, she was furniture. But Jose's eyes followed her movements with an intensity that made her breath catch. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His eyes said everything. Her heart raced, not from fear, but from something she didn't want to name whenever she served his table. Something that felt like standing too close to a fire. Something that made her want to look at him and run from him all at once. The room hummed with tension. Low voices discussing shipments and territories and people who'd made mistakes. The clink of silverware against china. The soft pour of wine into crystal. Every sound felt amplified, like the whole world had narrowed to this one room, this one table, this one man who sat at the center of it all like a storm waiting to break. In his world, trust was currency and betrayal was death. Betty knew that. Everyone knew that. So she kept her eyes down, her movements efficient, her presence invisible. She had no idea that in less than an hour, invisibility would become impossible. That the most dangerous man in New York would need her to be seen. That her voice would be the only thing standing between him and death. Betty returned to clear the appetizer plates, moving around the table with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd learned to be a shadow. But when she reached Jose's side, something shifted. He turned his head slightly, and for just a moment, their eyes met. The room went quiet as their eyes locked. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. Maybe less. But in those seconds, Betty felt something dangerous unfold in her chest. His gaze wasn't cold like she'd expected. It was searching. Intense. Like he was trying to read a language written on her soul. She looked away first, her cheeks flushing, her hands suddenly unsteady as she lifted his plate. Jose Newton didn't smile, didn't speak, but something in his expression softened. Just barely. Just enough for her to notice. He'd seen her. Actually seen her. And that terrified her more than his reputation ever could. Across the table, a man with slicked-back hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes watched the exchange with interest. Marco Desanti, Jose's business associate. His suit was expensive, his watch even more so, but there was something cheap about the way he carried himself. Something oily. Betty had served him before, and always felt like she needed to wash her hands afterward. "Your waitress seems attentive," Marco said, his voice smooth as poison. "Very attentive." Jose's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "She's doing her job." "Of course." Marco leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine. Just an observation. The tension between them was thick enough to choke on. Betty could feel it as she moved to the sideboard, could feel the weight of unspoken threats hanging in the air like smoke. These men smiled and laughed and clinked glasses, but underneath it all was something sharp. Something deadly. A waiter appeared at the door carrying a bottle of champagne, the vintage kind that cost thousands. He approached the table with reverence, showing Jose the label. Jose nodded his approval. Then his phone buzzed. His main bodyguard, a mountain of a man named Victor who never left Jose's side, glanced at the screen and leaned down to whisper something urgent in Jose's ear. Jose's expression hardened. He gave a subtle nod, and Victor straightened, already moving toward the door. "I need to take this," Victor said quietly, his hand already on his phone. 2 minutes. Jose waved him off, his attention returning to Marco and the others at the table. Victor disappeared into the hallway, the door clicking shut behind him. The room felt different suddenly. Lighter. More vulnerable. Betty, arranging fresh napkins on the sideboard, felt a cold prickle run down her spine. Something about this moment felt wrong, like a held breath before a scream. The waiter began pouring the champagne, moving around the table with practiced grace. Golden liquid filled crystal glasses one by one. Marco watched with hooded eyes, his fingers drumming softly against the table. One wrong move, and everything would collapse. Betty moved toward the table with the champagne bottle, her assignment to ensure every glass stayed full. The waiter had poured the initial round, But in rooms like this, service was constant, attentive, invisible. She lifted the heavy bottle from its ice bucket, feeling the cold condensation against her palms. Her focus was intense because she felt seen by Jose. That brief moment when their eyes had met kept replaying in her mind like a song she couldn't stop hearing. It made her hyper-aware of every movement, every breath. She wanted to be perfect, professional, worthy of that searching gaze, even though she knew how dangerous that want was. She approached Jose's side of the table, careful not to brush against his chair. The other associates were deep in conversation about shipping routes and territory disputes, their voices low and coded. Jose listened more than he spoke, his expression unreadable, his fingers resting lightly on the stem of his champagne flute. Betty began topping up the glasses, moving clockwise around the table. She filled the glass of the man to Jose's right, then moved to the next. Her attention was split between her task and the awareness of Jose's presence, just inches away. The warmth radiating from him, the subtle scent of expensive cologne and danger. That's when it happened. Marco leaned forward suddenly, gesturing animatedly as he made some point about quarterly projections. His other associates turned to look at him, following his words. Even Jose's attention shifted slightly toward Marco's presentation. It was smooth, practiced, a magician's misdirection. And in that half-second of distraction, Marco's hand moved. Betty saw it because she was the only one not watching his face. She was watching his hands. The way his left hand continued gesturing while his right hand dropped beneath the table's edge, then rose again with fluid precision. He reached across, casual as breathing, and switched Jose's full champagne glass with an identical one from his own place setting. The movement lasted maybe 2 seconds. Smooth, confident, deadly. Betty's breath caught in her throat. Her hands froze on the champagne bottle. Every shadow held a threat he couldn't ignore. Jose had built his empire on paranoia, on seeing betrayals before they bloomed. But he hadn't seen this. None of his remaining bodyguards positioned by the walls had seen it. The angles were wrong. The timing was perfect. Only Betty had witnessed it. The invisible waitress. The shadow in the corner. She felt seen, and that terrified her. Because now she knew. Now she carried a secret that could kill her just for existing in her mind. In his world, witnesses didn't survive. Especially witnesses to murder. Marco settled back in his chair, his smile easy, his hand now resting innocently on the table. He picked up his own glass, the one that had been Jose's, and took a casual sip. One wrong move, and everything would collapse. And Betty was holding the weight of that collapse in her trembling hands. Jose reached for the glass, his fingers wrapping around the delicate stem with the same controlled precision he brought to everything. He lifted it slowly, the champagne catching the candlelight like liquid gold. The conversation around the table quieted as the others recognized the gesture. A toast was coming. To profitable partnerships, Jose said, his voice low and commanding. The kind of voice that didn't need volume to fill a room. And to loyalty. The irony of that word, loyalty, would have been funny if it wasn't about to be lethal. The other men raised their glasses. Marco raised his with a smile that made Betty's skin crawl. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into an eternity. She watched Jose's hand bring the glass closer to his lips. Watched the liquid tilt slightly in anticipation. Watched the most dangerous man in New York move toward his own death with complete, terrible trust. Betty's mind raced. Speaking up means certain death for her. She knew that with absolute clarity. Waitresses who interfered in the business of men like Jose Newton didn't walk out of rooms like this. They disappeared. Became warnings. Became cautionary tales whispered in kitchens and back alleys. But silence means death for him. And somehow, impossibly, that mattered more. She thought about her mother's advice. Stay invisible. Stay safe. Survive. But she also thought about the way Jose had looked at her earlier. The way he'd seen her when no one else did. The way his gaze had made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she was worth being seen. She'd spent her whole life needing to be protected, building walls to keep the dangerous world out. But what if protection wasn't about hiding? What if it was about being brave enough to speak? Every time he stepped closer, her breath vanished. And now he was seconds away from never stepping anywhere again. Betty moved before she could think, before fear could paralyze her. She rushed forward, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Her hand shot out and landed on Jose's shoulder, solid, warm, forbidden, stopping the glass inches from his lips. The room froze. Jose's eyes snapped to her face, dark and deadly, filled with a warning that would have dropped most people to their knees. But Betty leaned in close, so close she could feel the heat of his skin, so close her lips almost brushed his ear. She whispered 4 words that would change everything. I saw them switch drink. Her voice shook, but it was clear.
Certain.
Terrified and brave all at once. Please, she added, her hand trembling against his shoulder. Don't drink it. The air between them tightened. Jose didn't move, didn't breathe. His eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that burned. And in that moment, Betty knew. Speaking up, even when you're invisible, even when you're terrified, even when the most dangerous man in New York holds your life in his hands, is the bravest thing anyone can do. The Mafia Boss almost died because of one treacherous, evil man. Hit subscribe right now if you believe betrayal should always be exposed. Only cowards and manipulators won't subscribe.
Jose didn't speak.
He didn't have to. His eyes said everything. For 3 heartbeats, he held Betty's gaze with an intensity that stripped away every defense she'd ever built. She saw the calculation happening behind those dark eyes. The assessment. The decision between trusting a terrified waitress and trusting his own instincts that had kept him alive for 20 years in a world designed to kill him. Then, with deliberate precision, he set the glass down on the table. The soft clink of crystal against wood was the loudest sound in the room. His face became a mask of cold fury. Not hot anger. Not explosive rage. Something far more dangerous. The kind of cold that burned. The kind of fury that ended bloodlines. Look at me, Jose said, his voice low and controlled. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Every word carried the weight of absolute authority. Betty's knees felt weak, but she held his gaze. Her hand was still on his shoulder, trembling now, but she didn't pull away. Tell me exactly what you saw. It wasn't a request. It was a command that expected obedience, delivered in a tone that had made grown men confess their sins and beg for mercy. Betty's voice shook, but the words came out clear. The man across from you. The one in the gray suit. She didn't know his name, didn't need to. When everyone was looking at him, listening to him talk about projections, his right hand went under the table. Then he reached across and switched her glass with his. It took 2 seconds. Maybe less. But I saw it. The room had gone so quiet that Betty could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Jose's eyes hardened to black ice. He turned his head slightly, just enough to look at Marco. The movement was minimal, but the threat in it was absolute. Marco's smile faltered. Just for a second. Just long enough. Jose's hand moved in a gesture so subtle Betty almost missed it. But his remaining bodyguards didn't miss it. They moved like shadows coming to life, smooth and silent and utterly lethal. 2 of them flanked Marco before he could even push back his chair. Wait, Jose, what is this? Marco's voice pitched higher, the oily confidence draining away. What did she tell you? She's just a waitress, she doesn't know. Stand up, one of the bodyguards said quietly. Marco stood, his hands raised in protest. This is insane. You're going to believe some girl over me? Over our partnership? Jose finally stood, and when he did, every man at that table seemed to shrink. He moved around the table with the deliberate pace of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to run. He stopped in front of Marco, picked up the glass Marco had been drinking from, the original glass that had been Jose's, held it up to the light. Drink it, Jose said softly. Marco went pale. What? You switched the glasses. So drink from mine. The silence was deafening. I didn't. Jose's expression didn't change. He didn't need to raise his voice. He simply looked at his bodyguards and said one word: secure him. Marco was dragged from the room, his protests turning to desperate pleas that died behind the heavy door. The other associates sat frozen, their faces carefully blank, knowing that any reaction could mark them as complicit. Jose didn't look at them. His attention had shifted entirely to Betty, who stood trembling by the table, her hand still gripping the champagne bottle like a lifeline. "Come with me," Jose said. It wasn't a request. He moved toward a side door Betty had never noticed before, one that blended seamlessly into the wood paneling. She hesitated for only a second before following, her legs unsteady beneath her. Jose's hand settled on the small of her back, firm and possessive, guiding her through the doorway into a dimly lit corridor. Two bodyguards materialized from the shadows, flanking them instantly. "No one touches you," Jose said, and though he was speaking to his men, his hand pressed slightly more firmly against Betty's back. The message was clear. She was under his protection now. His claim. They walked through a maze of hallways until they reached a small private room. Elegant, windowless, soundproof. The kind of room where secrets were kept and decisions were made. Jose nodded to his bodyguards, and they took positions outside, closing the door with a soft click that felt final. Suddenly, they were alone. The dominance that had radiated from Jose in the dining room, that cold, controlled fury, cracked. Betty watched it happen in real time. His shoulders dropped slightly. His jaw unclenched. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, disrupting it, making him look almost human. "Stay close," he said quietly, and there was something raw in his voice now. Something vulnerable. Betty stood frozen in the center of the room, her uniform wrinkled, her hands still shaking. She felt like she'd just survived an earthquake, and the ground was still trembling beneath her feet. Jose turned to face her fully, and for the first time, she saw past the mask, past the reputation,
Past the storm.
She saw a man who just realized he'd been seconds from death. "You have no idea what you just saved me from," he said, his voice low and rough. "Not just my life. Everything I've built. Everyone who depends on me." He took a step closer, and Betty's breath caught. The air between them tightened. "I don't trust anyone," Jose continued, his dark eyes searching hers. "I can't. In my world, trust is a luxury that gets you killed." He paused, something flickering across his face that looked almost like wonder. "Except you." The words hung between them, impossibly heavy. "You're a target now," Jose said, his tone hardening with protective fury. "Marco wasn't working alone. Whoever hired him will know you're the reason their plan failed. They'll come for you." He stepped back, forcing distance between them even though everything in his body language screamed that he wanted the opposite. "You should stay away from me." Betty's heart hammered in her chest. Every logical part of her brain screamed that he was right, that she should run.
Disappear.
Go back to being invisible. But she'd already crossed that line. She'd already been seen. "Then let me decide," Betty whispered. Jose's eyes blazed. The room went quiet as their eyes locked. Betty chose courage over comfort to save a life. Like this video if you admire her bravery. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of activity that Betty only saw glimpses of. Jose's organization moved with surgical efficiency. Phone calls were made in languages Betty didn't understand. Men in dark suits came and went from secure locations. Marco disappeared, and with him, the entire network of conspirators who'd planned Jose's assassination. Betty never saw the violence. Jose made sure of that. But she felt its aftermath in the tension that slowly drained from his bodyguard's shoulders, in the way Jose's jaw finally unclenched when he received a particular phone call, in the cold satisfaction that flickered across his face when he said simply, "It's done." The threat had been eliminated. Swiftly.
Cleanly. Completely.
Now Jose stood in front of Betty in a penthouse apartment she'd been brought to for her safety. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Manhattan, the city glittering below like a kingdom he controlled. She'd been here for 2 days, guarded constantly, fed meals she couldn't taste, sleeping in silk sheets that felt like a cage. "You can't go back," Jose said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Not to your apartment. Not to the restaurant. Not to your old life. Betty's throat tightened. What are you saying? I'm saying you have a choice. He moved closer, and she could feel the heat radiating from him, could smell that intoxicating mix of expensive cologne and danger. You can leave New York entirely. I'll set you up somewhere safe. New identity. New city. Enough money to start over. He paused, his dark eyes burning into hers.
Or you stay.
With me. Under my protection. In my world. Betty's heart raced, not from fear, but from something she didn't want to name. That's not really a choice. No, Jose agreed, his voice dropping to that low, commanding register that made her knees weak. It's not. Because either way, you're mine to protect. The only question is how close I get to keep you. She should have said no. Should have taken the escape he was offering. Should have run as far from this dangerous, impossible man as she could get. But she hated how much she wanted him to stay. Hated how the thought of leaving, of never seeing him again, of going back to being invisible, felt worse than the danger. If I stay, Betty whispered. What does that mean? Jose's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone with unexpected gentleness. It means you're safe. It means no one touches you. It means you're no longer alone in the city that tried to swallow you. His closeness felt dangerous and irresistible all at once. It means, he continued, his voice rough with something that sounded like need, that I get to see you every day. That you're not just someone I failed to protect. You're someone I choose to keep. Betty closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision. Terrified, pulled by an irresistible, dangerous closeness she'd never felt before. I'll stay, she breathed. When she opened her eyes, Jose was smiling. Barely, but it was there. Good, he said simply. Because I wasn't letting you go anyway. This chapter proves that people will lie and cheat to win. Comment, I choose honesty if you always speak your truth. 3 months passed like a dream Betty couldn't wake from. Or maybe didn't want to. She lived in a world of luxury now. Penthouse apartments with views that stretched to the horizon. Cars with drivers who opened doors and never asked questions. Closets filled with clothes she'd never have been able to afford in 10 lifetimes of serving champagne. But luxury came with a price. She was constantly watched. Jose's security followed her everywhere, shadows in expensive suits who kept their distance but were always there. She couldn't go anywhere without permission. Couldn't see anyone from her old life. Couldn't even stand by a window without someone checking the sightlines first. She was safe. She was isolated. She was his. And somehow, impossibly, she didn't hate it. Their relationship deepened through intense, quiet moments. Jose would come to her at the end of long days that left blood on his hands he'd never let her see. He'd sit beside her on the couch, not touching, just existing in her presence like she was oxygen he'd forgotten he needed. They'd talk about everything and nothing, her childhood, his favorite books, the way the city looked at 3 in the morning when the rest of the world was sleeping. One night, he found her standing by the window, watching the lights of Manhattan twinkle like fallen stars. He came up behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body, but not quite touching. What are you thinking? He asked, his voice low and rough. That I should be more afraid of you than I am, Betty admitted. Jose was quiet for a long moment. Then he stepped closer, eliminating the last inch of space between them. His hand came up to rest gently on her waist, and she felt every nerve in her body light up like fire. He leaned in, slow, deliberate, until she could feel his breath against her neck. Are you afraid of me now? No, Betty whispered. I'm afraid of how much I'm not. He turned her around to face him, and the look in his eyes was something she'd never seen before.
Raw.
Vulnerable. Almost desperate. I wasn't supposed to feel this, Jose said, his voice breaking slightly on the last word. I built walls higher than buildings to keep everyone out. To keep myself safe. His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb tracing her lower lip. Then you whispered for words and tore them all down. Betty's hands found their way to his chest, feeling his heart thunder beneath her palms. "Jose, I'm happy," he interrupted, and the confession sounded like it hurt him to say. "For the first time in 20 years, I'm actually happy. And it terrifies me." Then he smiled. A real, genuine smile that transformed his entire face, softening the hard edges, erasing the cold calculation, revealing the man beneath the monster everyone feared. Betty realized in that moment that she had more power over Jose Newton than his entire empire. He'd given her something no amount of money or threat could buy. His trust. His heart. His happiness. Jose almost let betrayal win because he was blind. Hit subscribe if you agree that even powerful people need to be able to trust someone. 6 months passed, and Jose Newton's empire had never been stronger. Territories were secured. Rivals were neutralized. His organization ran with the precision of a Swiss watch, every moving part perfectly synchronized. To the outside world, he was still the storm they feared, ruthless, calculating, untouchable. But inside, everything had changed. Every decision he made now carried her name. Every deal he negotiated was filtered through one question: will this keep Betty safe? His ruthlessness hadn't diminished, but it had found a purpose beyond survival. He protected his empire because his empire protected her. The penthouse had become their sanctuary. Late one evening, Jose found Betty standing on the terrace. The city sprawled beneath them like a kingdom of light. The November air was cold, but she didn't seem to notice. He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. She fit there perfectly, like she'd been designed for that exact space. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his lips close to her ear. "That's 6 months ago. I was serving champagne and counting tips," Betty said softly. "And now I'm here, with you. And it still doesn't feel real." Jose was quiet for a long moment, his arms tightening around her. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw with vulnerability. "I thought success would fill something inside me," he admitted. "I built an empire thinking that power, money, control, that it would be enough. But it just made the emptiness bigger. Every victory felt hollow. Every achievement felt meaningless." He turned her around gently, needing to see her face. The city lights reflected in his dark eyes, making them almost soft. "Then you whispered those 4 words," Jose continued, his hands framing her face like she was something precious, something breakable. "And suddenly, everything shifted. You didn't just save my life that night, Betty. You gave me a reason to have one." Betty's breath caught. She'd seen him order men's deaths with less emotion than he was showing now. Jose looked into her eyes, and there was no mask anymore. No walls. No storm. Just a man who'd finally found something worth being vulnerable for. "You changed my life," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You saved more than just my empire. You saved me from becoming the emptiness I'd built around myself." Betty reached up, her fingers tracing the sharp line of his jaw. He leaned into her touch like a man starved for gentleness. "Don't be afraid," she whispered back. "Not of me. Not of this." Jose closed his eyes, and for the first time in his life, he felt something he'd never thought possible.
Peace. Contentment.
The deep, lasting kind that didn't come from conquering territories or eliminating threats. It came from her hands on his face, her breath mingling with his, her presence filling the spaces inside him he'd thought were permanently broken. "I'm not afraid anymore," Jose said, opening his eyes to meet hers. "Not when I'm with you." He kissed her then, soft and slow, and the most dangerous man in New York finally understood what it meant to be saved. If you can't stand people who betray trust for money, hit that subscribe button and comment "Loyalty Forever."